Michael had always thought of his wife, Laura, as the epitome of loyalty. After 10 years of marriage, he believed their connection was unshakable. Sure, their relationship had its ups and downs, but whose didn't? That belief was shattered one fateful evening when he stumbled across something that would alter his life forever. It began innocently enough. Laura had been spending more time with Michael's uncle, Frank, lately. Frank was a charismatic man in his late 40s, with a silver-tongued charm and a knack for making everyone in the room feel special. He had recently moved back to town after separating from his wife, Sandra. Frank claimed he needed family support, and Michael had welcomed him with open arms, never suspecting his kindness would be repaid with betrayal. Michael noticed Laura's demeanor shift subtly over time. She laughed a little too hard at Frank's jokes, stayed behind to chat with him after family gatherings, and seemed unusually preoccupied when Frank wasn't around. Michael chalked it up to his imagination, but doubts gnawed at him. One evening, after a family barbecue at Frank's house, Michael realized Laura had disappeared. He searched the house and found her in the garage, standing far too close to Frank. Her hand rested lightly on his arm as they spoke in hushed tones, their smiles secretive. "What's going on here?" Michael's voice cut through the air like a knife. Laura jumped back, her face flushing red. "Nothing. We were just talking." Frank, ever the smooth talker, grinned. "Relax, Mike. We were just reminiscing about old times." Michael's gut told him otherwise, but he forced a smile and said nothing. That night, he couldn't sleep. Something about their interaction felt off, and his suspicions only grew stronger. A week later, Michael's worst fears were confirmed. While tidying the bedroom, he noticed Laura's phone left unlocked on the dresser. He hesitated, his heart pounding. He had never invaded her privacy before, but something compelled him to look. What he found made his blood run cold. A series of messages between Laura and Frank left no room for doubt. The texts were flirtatious, filled with inside jokes, longing, and plans to meet in secret. One message stood out. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Same place, same time? Love you." Michael's hands shook as he scrolled through the damning evidence. He felt sick, betrayed by the two people he trusted most. That night, Michael confronted Laura. She tried to deny it at first, but when he presented the messages, her defenses crumbled. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she sobbed. It just did." "How long?" Michael demanded, his voice trembling with anger. "A few months," Laura admitted, unable to meet his gaze. Michael's heart shattered. He packed a bag and left the house, seeking refuge at a friend's place. That night he began researching divorce attorneys. Filing for divorce was the hardest thing Michael had ever done. Laura begged him to reconsider, promising to end the affair and work on their marriage, but the trust was gone. He couldn't look at her without seeing betrayal. As the legal proceedings began, Michael found himself in an unexpected situation. Sandra, Frank's estranged wife, reached out to him. She'd heard whispers about the affair and wanted to offer her support. Their first meeting was awkward. Sandra was a striking woman with a sharp wit and a no-nonsense attitude. Over coffee, she vented about Frank's history of infidelity and expressed sympathy for Michael's situation. "He's a charmer," Sandra said with a bitter laugh. "But he always leaves a trail of destruction in his wake." Michael nodded, finding comfort in Sandra's candor. Their shared experience created an unexpected bond, and they began meeting regularly to discuss their respective divorces and the fallout from Frank and Laura's actions. As weeks turned into months, Michael and Sandra's connection deepened. What started as mutual commiseration blossomed into something more. Sandra's strength and resilience inspired Michael, while his empathy and kindness gave her hope for the future. One evening, after a long dinner filled with laughter and heartfelt conversation, Sandra placed her hand on Michael's. "Do you ever think about starting over?" she asked softly. Michael hesitated, then nodded. "I do. But it's hard to imagine trusting anyone again." Sandra smiled gently. "Maybe trust doesn't have to come all at once. Maybe it's something we build, piece by piece." For the first time in months, Michael felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the end of one chapter could lead to the beginning of another. Unbeknownst to them, Laura and Frank's relationship was already unraveling. The secrecy and excitement that fueled their affair couldn't sustain a real partnership. As cracks began to show, Frank's wandering eye resurfaced, and Laura found herself questioning whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The stage was set for a tangled web of emotions, confrontations, and unexpected twists as Michael and Sandra navigated their burgeoning relationship, while Laura and Frank faced the fallout of their betrayal. Michael and Sandra's connection continued to grow as their shared pain turned into a mutual appreciation for one another. What started as late-night conversations and shared meals evolved into something deeper. Michael found himself looking forward to their time together, appreciating Sandra's sharp humor and her ability to make him feel understood. Meanwhile, Laura and Frank's relationship began to show cracks. The excitement of their affair had worn off, leaving behind the realities of a mismatched partnership. Frank's wandering eye resurfaced, and Laura grew increasingly suspicious of his late nights and vague explanations. One evening, as Laura prepared dinner at Frank's house, she noticed his phone buzzing on the counter. A message preview caught her eye. "Can't wait to see you tonight, babe." Her heart sank. Confronting him was inevitable, but Laura hesitated, unsure if she could handle the truth. Michael and Sandra decided to take a step forward in their budding relationship. It wasn't easy for either of them. Both were still navigating the emotional aftermath of their failed marriages, but they agreed to take things slowly. Their first official date was simple yet meaningful, a walk through a local park followed by coffee at a quiet cafe. "I didn't think I'd be doing this again," Sandra admitted as they strolled through the park. "Dating, I mean? It feels strange." Michael nodded. "It does. But it also feels right. Being with you makes me feel like I can breathe again." Sandra smiled, her cheeks tinged with pink. "You have no idea how much that means to me." Back at Frank's house, Laura's suspicions reached a boiling point. She decided to follow him the next time he claimed to have business to attend to. Her worst fears were confirmed when she saw him meeting another woman at a hotel. The betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow, especially after she had risked everything for him. That night, Laura confronted Frank. "How could you?" she demanded, tears streaming down her face. "I left my marriage for you." Frank's response was callous. "You knew who I was when this started. Don't act surprised now." His words stung, leaving Laura reeling. For the first time, she questioned whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Michael and Sandra's relationship didn't go unnoticed. Friends and family began to whisper, their judgments unspoken but palpable. At a family gathering, one of Michael's cousins pulled him aside. "You and Sandra?" the cousin asked, raising an eyebrow. "Isn't that a little complicated?" Michael shrugged, refusing to let the comment shake him. "Complicated, maybe. But it's real. And after everything we've been through, that's all that matters." Sandra faced similar scrutiny from her own circle. Her sister's disapproval was particularly harsh. Frank was a terrible husband, but dating his nephew? "What are you thinking?" her sister asked. "I'm thinking about my happiness," Sandra replied firmly. "And for the first time in years, I'm finding it." The awkwardness reached its peak during a chance encounter at a local restaurant. Michael and Sandra were enjoying dinner when Laura and Frank walked in. The tension was immediate, and all four froze, unsure of how to proceed. Frank, ever the opportunist, broke the silence with a smirk. "Well, isn't this cozy?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Sandra's jaw tightened. "Not as cozy as your revolving door of mistresses, I'm sure." Laura's face burned with embarrassment. Michael stood, his voice calm but firm. "Let's go, Sandra. We have better things to do than waste time here." As they left, Sandra couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. For the first time, she felt like she had taken back control of her narrative. Laura returned home that night feeling hollow. Her life with Frank was falling apart, and she couldn't stop thinking about Michael. Memories of their marriage flooded her mind, and for the first time, she allowed herself to admit that she missed him. But Michael was moving on. And Laura couldn't ignore the fact that the woman he was moving on with was Sandra, the very person who had once been wronged by Frank as well. As Michael and Sandra's relationship deepened, they began discussing the future. Both were cautious but hopeful, recognizing that their shared history, while painful, gave them a unique understanding of one another. "Do you think we'll always be seen as the ones who broke the rules?" Sandra asked one evening. Michael took her hand, his gaze steady. "Maybe. But what matters is how we see ourselves. And I see us as two people who found something real in the middle of all this chaos." Sandra smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that they might have a chance at happiness. Michael and Sandra's relationship continued to blossom, but their happiness wasn't without its challenges. Both knew that pursuing a relationship after the tangled web of betrayal would invite judgment. They leaned on each other, building a bond stronger than either had anticipated, but they weren't prepared for the bombshell that was about to drop. Laura's growing feelings of regret began to consume her. Every time she saw Michael with Sandra, the ache in her chest deepened. She started reaching out to Michael, under the guise of discussing unresolved divorce matters. "I just think we should talk," Laura said over the phone one evening. "There are things I need to say." Michael hesitated. "I'm not sure what there is left to talk about, Laura. We've finalized everything." "It's not about that," Laura said, her voice breaking. "It's about us. I miss you, Michael." The words hit him like a punch. He glanced over at Sandra, who was curled up on the couch, engrossed in a book. He lowered his voice. "This isn't the time, Laura. And honestly, it's not fair." "Not fair?" she snapped. "You think I'm the only one who made mistakes? You moved on so quickly, with Sandra of all people." Michael's tone hardened. "You don't get to play the victim here. You and Frank made your choices. Now I'm making mine." Frank, meanwhile, was unraveling. His relationship with Laura had all but imploded, and his reputation among family and friends was in tatters. To make matters worse, his financial troubles were mounting. With his charm losing its effectiveness, Frank began lashing out at those around him, including Laura. One evening, during a heated argument, Frank revealed something that left Laura reeling. "You think you were the only one?" Frank sneered. "I've had plenty of women on the side. You were just convenient." Laura's face drained of color. "How could you say that to me? After everything I gave up for you?" Frank shrugged, unbothered. "You made your choice, Laura. Don't blame me if you regret it." The conversation was a wake-up call. Laura realized that the life she had destroyed her marriage for was built on lies. For the first time, she considered that Michael had been the one she should have fought for all along. Sandra's ex-husband, Frank, wasn't ready to let go of her either. After learning about her relationship with Michael, he started reaching out, using every excuse to stir the pot. "I just think it's funny," Frank said during one of his calls to Sandra. "You talk about loyalty and respect, but you're dating my nephew? What does that say about you?" Sandra's patience was wearing thin. "It says that I'm done with you, Frank. Stop calling me." "Or what?" Frank taunted. "You're going to run crying to Michael? Face it, Sandra. You'll always be tied to me, whether you like it or not." Sandra hung up, but the conversation left her shaken. She didn't tell Michael about the call, not wanting to add to his stress, but the weight of Frank's words lingered. The next family gathering was a powder keg waiting to explode. Michael and Sandra arrived together, drawing curious glances and whispered comments. Frank, already nursing a drink, made no effort to hide his disdain. "Well, if it isn't the happy couple," Frank said loudly, raising his glass. "I'm surprised you two had the nerve to show up." Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "We're here for family, not drama, Frank. Let's keep it civil." Frank smirked. "Civil? That's rich, coming from you." Before Michael could respond, Laura stepped in. "That's enough, Frank. You don't get to ruin this for everyone." The room fell silent. Laura's defense of Michael surprised everyone, including herself. Frank scoffed, but the momentary unity between Laura and Michael didn't go unnoticed. Later that evening, Laura approached Michael as he stood alone on the patio. "Thank you for staying calm back there," she said softly. "Frank, he's been unraveling lately." Michael nodded. "He's always been good at causing chaos." Laura hesitated, then added, "I meant what I said earlier. I miss you. And I'm sorry for everything." Michael looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate the apology, Laura. But we've both moved on." Laura's eyes glistened with tears. "Have you? Can you honestly say you don't still think about us?" Michael sighed, his resolve wavering for a moment before he regained his composure. "Thinking about the past doesn't mean I want to go back to it. I'm building something new now, something healthy. And I won't jeopardize that." As the night wore on, tension simmered but didn't boil over. However, the fragile equilibrium was clearly temporary. With Laura's lingering feelings, Frank's manipulations, and the scrutiny of their family, Michael and Sandra's path forward remained fraught with challenges. The question wasn't just whether they could withstand the pressure, it was whether they could do so without collateral damage to those around them. The pressure building around Michael and Sandra's relationship reached its peak in the weeks following the family gathering. Laura's apologies grew more frequent, often accompanied by nostalgic memories of their marriage. Meanwhile, Frank's disruptive behavior became increasingly erratic, further straining everyone's patience. Sandra's phone buzzed with a new message as she sat with Michael on their couch one evening. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "Frank again?" Michael asked, noticing her expression. Sandra nodded. "He's been texting nonstop, asking to meet up. He says he wants closure." Michael's brow furrowed. "Do you believe him?" "Not really," Sandra admitted. "But ignoring him doesn't seem to be working either." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe it's time to set some firm boundaries. Let's go together and make it clear he needs to leave you alone." Sandra hesitated but eventually agreed. "All right. But let's keep it public. I don't trust him." The next day, they met Frank at a bustling cafe. True to form, Frank arrived late, his confident swagger undercut by the faint smell of alcohol. He slid into the seat across from them, flashing his trademark smirk. "Well, if it isn't the happy couple," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Sandra didn't waste time. "Frank, we're here because your constant messages need to stop. We've both moved on, and you need to do the same." Frank leaned back in his chair, feigning nonchalance. "Moved on? You're dating my nephew, Sandra. That's not moving on, that's a soap opera plot." Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "This isn't about you, Frank. It's about us setting boundaries. If you can't respect that, we'll have to take further steps." Frank's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of anger. "Further steps? Like what? A restraining order? Come on, Mike. Don't pretend you're better than me." Sandra interjected, her voice firm. "We're done here, Frank. This is your last warning." Frank's gaze lingered on Sandra for a moment before he stood abruptly. "Fine. But don't come crying to me when this little fairy tale falls apart." He stormed out, leaving Michael and Sandra to exchange weary glances. Back at home, they tried to shake off the encounter, but it left a lingering unease. Michael couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Frank's bitterness might escalate. Meanwhile, Laura's attempts to rekindle her connection with Michael took a surprising turn. She showed up unannounced at his workplace one afternoon, her eyes filled with determination. "Laura, what are you doing here?" Michael asked, stepping out of his office to speak with her in the hallway. "I need to say this in person," she said. "I made a mistake, Michael. A huge mistake. I should have fought for us instead of throwing it all away. I want another chance." Michael's heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Laura, we're past that. You made your choice, and I've moved on." "With Sandra?" Laura countered, her voice rising. "Do you really think she's the answer? She's just as broken as Frank is." Michael's patience snapped. That's enough. Sandra's been nothing but supportive and kind, things you stopped being a long time ago. Leave her out of this. Laura's face crumpled, and she turned to leave. I'll always love you, Michael, she said over her shoulder. Even if you can't see it. The tension came to a head during a family reunion a few weeks later. Everyone was there, including Laura and Frank, who seemed determined to make their presence known. Michael and Sandra tried to keep a low profile, but it wasn't long before the confrontations began. Frank cornered Michael near the grill. You think you've won, don't you? He sneered. But you're just picking up my leftovers. Michael turned to face him, his voice low and steady. I'm not playing your games, Frank. You've already burned every bridge you had. Don't drag me down with you. At the same time, Laura approached Sandra, her tone dripping with condescension. Enjoying your new life, Sandra? Must be nice to pretend everything's fine. Sandra's eyes flashed with anger. It's better than clinging to the past and blaming everyone else for your mistakes. The arguments escalated, drawing the attention of other family members. Before things could spiral further, Michael and Sandra decided to leave, tired of the constant drama. As they drove home in silence, Sandra finally spoke. Do you think we'll ever escape this? Michael reached over, taking her hand in his. We will. It'll take time, but we'll get there. Together. Sandra smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing. Despite the chaos, she knew she'd made the right choice. And for the first time in a long time, so did Michael.